All right, welcome back. Last time we finished chapter 4, which was tissue. This time we're going to move on to the integumentary system, better known as the skin. And so one of the good things about this chapter, other than that it's relatively short, is that a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about really ties in nicely to what we talked about with the tissue chapter. So for example, we're going to talk about epithelial tissue, obviously, because skin is an example of epithelial tissue. But we'll also talk about connective tissue. Specifically, we'll talk a lot about areolar connective tissue. We'll also talk about dense, irregular connective tissue. We'll talk about glands some. So there's a lot of nice overlap between chapters 4 and 5. So in terms of the skin, so there's two layers, and the way I've got it laid out here is deep to superficial. So the dermis is the deeper of the two, which remember means farther from the skin surface, and then the epidermis is the more shallow of the two. So in terms of the name, so integument means covering, and so your integumentary tissue, your skin, obviously covers your entire body, which is where the name comes from. So the jobs of skin we'll go over in more specifics actually toward the end of the slideshow, but as you're probably aware, the general jobs of the skin or general functions of the skin are to form a barrier, so to keep things like pathogens, bacteria, viruses, etc., out of the body. So they form a barrier to protect us. In addition to that, they also help us hang on to our body water. Otherwise, we would just be constantly losing water. And so skin, it forms this sort of insulating barrier that keeps water in, and then for the most part keeps water from penetrating. And then it also, speaking of keeping things in, skin does a really good job at helping us hang on to our body heat, because we have to maintain our body temperature within fairly narrow limits. And so if we started losing a bunch of heat, well, then we'd have to generate body heat on our own through mechanisms like shivering, and that would cause us to use lots of extra energy that we wouldn't otherwise need to. So in that way, by helping us hang on to our heat, skin then helps us to be more efficient, helps us to lose or to use less energy. So as you're probably aware, skin kind of varies in thickness throughout the body. There are certain areas where the skin is thinner or thicker. With respect to the epidermis, so again, that most superficial layer, the skin is thickest on the soles of your feet. No surprise there, particularly like on your heels. You've got some pretty thick skin. You also have a fat pad underneath that to kind of cushion between the calcaneus, between your heel bone and the ground. So the combination of the fat pad and a really thick epidermis accounts for a significant cushion there under your heel. So in addition to having a fairly thick epidermis, fairly thick skin on the soles of the feet, you also have fairly thick skin on the palms of the hands as well. And so when I say thick skin, the epidermis in that area is about 1/1600ths of an inch, so on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. And then in areas on the face, particularly on the eyelids, you've got really thin skin, so rather than being 1/1600ths of an inch, it's more like 6/100ths of an inch, so about a third as thick in the areas of thinner skin. Now, when we talk about thin and thick skin, we're really only accounting for the epidermis there. There are other areas of the body where you have an extra thick dermis. So for example, the book talks about the upper back being one of those areas. And so if we combine the extra thick dermis with a relatively typical epidermis, then you have between the two fairly thick skin on the upper back. But if we just account for the epidermis, which is usually what we do, or usually what is done, if we're talking about thick skin, the thickest skin that you've got is, again, palms of the hands, soles of the feet. So other things to know. So we're actually going to start with the epidermis first. I know it's on the bottom, sorry. Should have reordered my slide. So the epidermis, as we talked about in chapter 4, is composed of epithelial cells, so specifically stratified squamous epithelium. So remember, you got square-shaped cells, and they're stacked on top of each other, more than 30 cell layers thick. So you got lots and lots of layers of them, so that's why it's stratified. Another thing about the epidermis is that it is avascular, and we touched on this a little bit in the tissue chapter as well. So if something is avascular, it doesn't have a blood supply. And so what does that mean from a practical standpoint? What that means is that all of the nutrients that these skin cells, which are called keratinocytes, all the nutrients that they need are going to actually diffuse up from this underlying connective tissue in the dermis. Okay, so you've got your circulation, you've got these small little capillaries here in the most superficial layer of the dermis. And so oxygen, carbon dioxide, amino acids, glucose, etc. will actually diffuse out of the blood in the dermis and then diffuse up and into the deeper layers of the epidermis. So, and then as we'll talk about, as cells get farther and farther from that supply line, the cells are going to eventually die, and we'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. The epidermis, all right, sorry, just talked about the epidermis. The dermis, there we go, is the deeper of the two. So whereas the epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium, the dermis is connective tissue. And so specifically, the types of connective tissue are actually formed from two different types of connective tissue. So this more superficial layer, the papillary layer, that is areolar connective tissue. So you got areolar connective tissue more superficially, and then deeper down, you have dense irregular connective tissue. So remember, dense, irregular, the dense refers to the concentration of collagen fibers. So if you've got a dense connective tissue, you've got lots and lots of collagen fibers. And then irregular refers to the directions that they run. So irregular connective tissue, or dense irregular, means the collagen fibers run every which direction. And the reason that matters is, of course, that skin is going to get a variety of insults. So maybe you're going to get some compression, where something like, mashes the skin and the underlying dermis and subcutaneous tissue. And so the deeper layer, the reticular layer of the dermis, has to be resistant to that compressive force. But then there are also shear forces. And so shear forces are going to be pushing perpendicular to the tissue. So going, maybe this way or this way. And so by having collagen fibers that run in a bunch of different directions in that reticular layer, it makes the dermis better able to withstand a variety of those stresses. It withstands compression, shear forces, tension, which is pulling apart, all of those things owing to the different directional arrangement of those collagen fibers. Something else about the dermis is that, as you can see here, the dermis is vascularized. So you got blood vessels down here, where it is vascular. So you got blood vessels down here that these are the larger ones that then branch into the smaller capillaries up here. So both layers of the dermis have direct blood supply. Both are vascular. And then underneath the dermis, you have something that's actually not part of the skin, but it's called the hypodermis. So the hypodermis, or subcutaneous tissue, is underneath the dermis. And so the hypodermis is also areolar connective tissue, with one important difference that you can readily see between it and this papillary layer of the dermis, which is, again, areolar connective tissue. So you got areolar connective tissue here, which is a loose connective tissue, and then areolar tissue down here. But they're different in appearance in that this subcutaneous tissue has a lot more adipocytes, has a lot more fat cells in it. And so that's what gives it its different appearance. Remember that for the most part, we store fat in our subcutaneous tissue. So we store fat for the most part underneath our skin. We do store it in other places. So you store it around the organs, which, as I've mentioned, is visceral fat. You store it, behind the eyes, and in a few other places in various fat pads. But for the most part, we store our fat in that subcutaneous tissue, and so that's part of the hypodermis. Remember that areolar connective tissue, again, that loose connective tissue, has quite a bit of extracellular matrix. There's a lot of space, and so just in the case of the hypodermis, that space is largely taken up by fat cells, by adipocytes. A couple things about that. So that is useful, as you would expect, in that subcutaneous tissue acts as a shock absorber. So, if something, we get hit by a baseball or something, and you get compression of the dermis, epidermis, and then subcutaneous tissue, that subcutaneous fat acts as a cushion to protect the underlying structures, which are generally muscle. So it helps kind of pad them some. And in addition to that, that fat acts as an insulator, because most of your heat comes from your skeletal muscles. Or viewed another way, your skeletal muscles are a really good source of heat production. And so if we need to get our core temperature up, as mentioned, one of the things that we're going to do is to shiver, which is an involuntary contraction of your skeletal muscles. And so when we do that, we're going to generate heat, and then that subcutaneous fat is going to help us keep that heat in, which is going to help us to increase our core temperature. All right, so let's talk about the epidermis in terms of different types of cells. So the primary type of cell in the epidermis are your keratinocytes. There may be another way of saying that, but that's my understanding of how to say it. So the reason they're called that is because those particular types of cells, the keratinocytes, are responsible for producing keratin, which is a fibrous protein that helps give the epidermis its primary protective quality. It makes those cells really hard. okay? And so then that's going to help it serve its protective purpose. Other things to know about them, so all these little brown cells, these are your keratinocytes, and you can see their appearance changes from these deeper layers to as we get more superficial, and we'll talk about why that happens here in a second. But other things to know about your keratinocytes, other than that they are eventually filled with keratin, which again, dense fibrous protein. In addition to that, between them, they have desmosomes, so that goes all the way back to chapter 3. Remember, desmosomes are kind of like that Velcro between cells that helps them resist, again, shear stresses, helps keep them from pulling apart. So those desmosomes help keep those keratinocytes connected to each other and helps them form a nice, solid line of defense. So again, keeping water in, keeping pathogens out. In addition to their desmosomes, they also have tight junctions, which plays a very important role in blocking water flow either way, keeping us from filling up with too much water or keeping too much water from escaping us. These cells, the keratinocytes, are undergoing almost constant mitosis. Remember that mitosis is cell splitting, and that's going to happen down here in the deepest layer, the stratum basal, which we'll talk about here in a second. But that is kind of this little squiggly layer where you've got these mitotic, so again, cells that split, mitotic keratinocytes that are going to just be constantly producing keratin. Mitotic keratinocytes, they're going to constantly be producing copies of themselves, right? So they're just going to be making more and more keratinocytes continuously. And the reason they do that is because we slough off these cells, all day long, right? So if especially if you've got dry skin, not to be gross, but sure, if you've got fairly dry skin, if something brushes up against you, sometimes you'll see some little flakes come off, right? Which means, maybe put some lotion on. But what's happening there is you're losing some of these superficial layers of keratinocytes. And so because that happens, all day long imperceptibly, we got to turn them over, we got to be producing them all the time. And so in fact, you turn over your skin every 4 to 6 weeks. So again, gives you some idea of how often we are losing those cells, especially if you consider that this most superficial layer is 30 cells deep, and then we have another, 10 to 20 cell layers deep to that. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 50 cell layers, you're turning over that whole set of cells every month approximately. Then we've got our melanocytes. So your melanocytes produce melanin, and so you can see the little gray thing down here is melanocyte, and so that is the pigment that gives our skin its characteristic tone. And one of the things about the melanocytes, and you can see it here, is that it has these little projections that go amongst and go between all these little keratinocytes. And so that helps it then, so it's going to produce melanin, that pigment, and then it is going to use these projections to distribute it to all of these nearby keratinocytes. And so what melanin does is it helps to protect those cells, specifically it helps to protect their DNA. Because what's going to happen is that melanin, so we see this particularly in skin that is exposed to sunlight, becomes darker, right? So if you're fairer skinned, we associate that with developing a tan. But effectively what happens is that sunlight then produces a stimulus, initiates this chemical messenger cascade from the keratinocytes, causing the melanocytes to produce more melanin. They then distribute it to these deeper layers of keratinocytes, and then that melanin migrates toward the superficial surface of that cell, basically just parks itself right on top of the cell's nucleus to act as a chemical shield against UV rays to protect that keratinocyte's DNA. Because if there problems develop with the DNA, then we get problems with protein production, and then potentially we can get problems with cancer, right? If cell reproduction or protein production goes awry, that can eventually become a cancerous cell, and then that is obviously dangerous. So the melanocytes then produce the pigment melanin, and the job of melanin is to protect the keratinocytes, specifically to protect the DNA of the keratinocytes from UV radiation. Then we've got our dendritic cells. So this little purple guy here is one of our dendritic cells. Those are the immune cells inside of the skin. So again, all of this is the epithelium. Not the epithelium, it is that. It is also the epithelium. It's the epidermis, sorry. But it is also epithelial tissue. But all this is the epidermis. Deep to that is the dermis. So these little dendritic cells then are immune cells inside of the epidermis. Okay, and so like the melanocytes, they also have projections as well. And so if they see foreign invaders, bacteria, etc., that have made it through these more superficial skin layers, especially if there's a disruption, so you get a cut or something or a scrape, some of those bacteria can make it down deeper into the deeper layers of the epidermis. And so when the dendritic cells see them, they will then attack those invading pathogens. And another important thing about the dendritic cells is, having just talked about melanocytes and DNA replication, if any of these cells become cancerous and start to engage in unchecked cell growth, the dendritic cells early on will generally take care of them. So any of these cells that are having reproduction issues, that become cancerous, the dendritic cells are our first line of defense. If they see that that cell has become a cancerous cell, they'll attack it and neutralize it. And then the last one on there is the tactile epithelial cell, little Merkel cell here, and then those are responsible for sensing touch. So they give us, sensation if something's touching your fingertips by mechanically compressing that little Merkel cell. Then that produces an electrical signal that goes from our fingertip back up to our brain that lets us know that we're touching something. All right, so let's go through the layers of the epidermis, deep to superficial. So we're starting on the bottom layer and then working our way toward the skin surface. So as mentioned, the deepest layer is the stratum basal. So as you can see on our diagram, that is down here, and it's a fairly thin layer. So important things to know about it. So other than the fact that it's the deepest epidermal layer, it's also attached to the underlying dermis. And there's this wavy border, which you can see here, and I have a better picture of it elsewhere, but this little wavy border there, that's where we've got the stratum basal. So that deepest layer there, kind of the darkest brown on this diagram, that is the stratum basal. And so again, at that layer, you've got a single row of stem cells, which are immature cells that can make copies of themselves, which is mitosis. And so they're just constantly making new keratinocytes, new skin cells. In that layer, you also have the melanocytes. So effectively what ends up happening is that the melanocytes in that stratum basal produce that melanin. They then use those projections to secrete it to those young keratinocytes. And then, again, that melanin is going to migrate to the superficial surface or superficial part of the intracellular fluid above the nucleus. But as those keratinocytes age, their lysosomes are actually going to break down that melanin. So we only have that pigment in these deeper layers. And then as the keratinocytes mature and eventually die, these are all dead cells up here, as they eventually die, the melanin goes away. And so that skin coloration, that melanin, is only in these deeper layers. And so why that matters for now, the melanocytes distribute that pigment down here in this deepest layer in the stratum basal. And so the melanocytes are fairly concentrated in that stratum basal. So they make up somewhere between 10% and 25% of cells in that layer. So 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 4 cells in that layer. So there are quite a few of them relative to the number of keratinocytes in that layer. If we move one more superficial, then we move on to the stratum spinosum. So this one's several cell layers thick, and that's where you start to see the keratinocytes really form those junctions with the nearby cells, with their neighbors. So that's where they're going to start to form those desmosomes, which again is that Velcro-like connection between the cells. They're going to start generating pre-keratin that'll eventually become keratin. And in addition, that's where those dendritic cells, that's where those immune cells are. Those are located in the stratum spinosum. So our cells are going, our keratinocytes are going from being brand new little cells down here to they're starting to mature, they're making some pre-keratin, they're making some connections to the cells around them, and then also between them are our dendritic cells that serve that immune function. Then if we move another cell layer more superficially, now our keratinocytes are really starting to mature. They're starting to do their job, which is to perform a protective, or become, sorry, a protective barrier. So that pre-keratin has now become keratin. So, and the keratin, that really tough protein, basically crowds out everything else in the cell. So you're going to start to see organelle deterioration. So we're going to get rid of, the nucleus eventually. Once we get to this top layer, they are, which is the corneum, they are anucleate. So they don't have a nucleus anymore. Get degeneration of the Golgi apparatus, the endoplasmic reticulum, ribosomes, etc. So all of those organelles eventually get replaced by keratin. But before that happens, one of the last things that cells produce is this water-resistant glycolipid. The name's not included, doesn't matter what it is. But what it does is, in addition to those desmosomes and tight junctions between the cell, the keratinocytes also then produce this, and a glycolipid is a combination of a sugar and a fat. They produce this combination, this glycolipid then, that sort of insulates the cells, if you will. It forms a waterproof barrier. And so what that does then is it keeps, again, water from getting in, water from getting out, but by forming that waterproof barrier, those keratinocytes also cut off their supply lines. So anything, any oxygen, carbohydrates, etc., that would have diffused up through these deeper layers of the epidermis, by the time we get to the granulosum up here, where we've laid down this glycolipid, they've cut themselves off from their supply line. They can't get any more oxygen. They can't get any more amino acids, etc. And so that then is going to result in the death of the cells. So once we get above the granulosum, those keratinocytes are now dead. In thick skin, so again, palms of the hands, soles of the feet for the most part, you're going to have this extra layer, the stratum lucidium, but it's only found in thick skin. So thicker skin, thicker epidermis, has 5 layers to it. Thinner skin only has 4. So the stratum lucidium is the one that disappears in thinner skin. So for example, the skin on your face, you're not going to have a stratum lucidium. Then the most superficial layer is the stratum corneum. So again, the cells are anucleate, so they don't have a nucleus anymore. That was part of that organelle deterioration in the granulosum. Lots and lots of cell layers here, because again, we're going to be sloughing these keratinocytes, the dead ones, constantly. So we have to have some backups to them. So lots of thickness there. It accounts for about 3/4 of the thickness of the epidermis. So the majority of our epidermis thickness is there. And by the time the keratinocytes get up here into the corneum, they've assumed their shape, that squamous shape, where they're kind of like those little flat, like floor tiles. And then because we've got 30 layers of them, that's what makes them stratified. So the reason this is stratified squamous epithelium is because of the shape of these most superficial keratinocytes, where they're that sort of square shape, and because there's lots of layers of them. So that's the epidermis. Then moving on to the dermis. So as mentioned, the dermis has 2 layers. There's the reticular dermis and then the papillary dermis. So to keep it consistent, I actually started with the deepest layer here as well. So because on the epidermis, we move from deep to superficial, we're doing the same thing here. So the reticular dermis, you can see here, is the deeper of the 2. And then the papillary dermis is the more superficial of the 2. So as you can tell from this diagram, the reticular layer is quite a bit thicker than the papillary layer. So the reticular layer accounts for about 80% of the thickness of the dermis. And as mentioned a little while ago, it is dense, irregular connective tissue. So you've got all these collagen fibers going every which direction, which then, again, is going to help it be resistant to different forces. So different shear forces, tensile forces, compressive forces, etc. All right. So as I was saying that, I was kind of looking at this diagram. These little muscles make your hairs stand on end. So like if you get scared, get cold, get goosebumps, those kinds of things, those are these little erector pili muscles. And then these little guys are going to be involved in sensation. We'll talk about them more in a minute, but whether or not something is touching you. And then you also have receptors in the hair follicles, these little follicle receptors, which you can see here, that on skin that has hair to it, if that hair gets deflected, so like when a mosquito or a fly or something lands on you and that moves your little hairs, and then you're aware that, oh, there's a mosquito on me, that's these little nerve endings here, the hair follicle receptors that told you that. And then we've got our little free nerve endings here. The free nerve endings are responsible for pain sensation. So if something, cuts me, if I get a burn, something like that, these generate that pain sensation. And we'll talk about our glands here in a minute. All right, so all those things are then in the reticular layer of the dermis. One other thing about the dermis, so I mentioned and spent a lot of time talking about the collagen fibers that are in the reticular layer, but there are also some elastic fibers in there as well. So remember that the collagen fibers are what give tissue its toughness, right? They don't really stretch much. They're basically kind of like steel cables. And then the elastic fibers are more like rubber bands. And so the elastic fibers are the ones that give skin its recoil property. So we can stretch it and then let it go and it bounces back. That is primarily the job of the elastic fibers, to generate that property. In our reticular layer, so as mentioned, that is areolar connective tissue. So that is loose connective tissue up here. And the reason that matters, a few things. One, so you've got these little blood vessels here. And so because this is mostly fluid, mostly water up here, that's going to allow all of those nutrients, oxygen, glucose, amino acids, etc., to diffuse out of the blood and into that deepest layer of the epidermis, into the stratum basal, so that we can supply the things that those cells need to be undergoing constant mitosis. So they got to have things like proteins, carbohydrates, fats, etc., that they need, the building blocks that they need to make new cells. And so we supply that by them diffusing through the blood. Again, this is a watery environment, so they diffuse kind of through that water and then up into that layer. In addition to that, thinking back to the kind of general schematic I showed you in chapter 4 of the areolar connective tissue, of the loose connective tissue, that there were macrophages and neutrophils in there, so immune cells in there as well. And so the fact that this is a fairly watery environment allows those immune cells to kind of constantly patrol. So they're just cruising around, waiting for something to make it through the epidermis that they can attack. All right, and that's what this looks like as well. So you can see the epidermis here. You can see the stratum basal down here, that darker layer deep. And then you got the papillary dermis down here. And then the reticular layer, you can see these thicker fibers there in that deeper layer. All right, and we already talked about melanin some. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything about melanin, but I think we hit on most of the important stuff. So again, melanin is the pigment that gives skin its characteristic color. Melanin can be slightly different shades, so it can be more of like a reddish yellow or a brownish black, depends upon the individual. But again, what it does is protects the DNA of the keratinocytes from UV radiation. So again, just to reiterate what I talked about earlier, that these deeper layers of the epidermis, so the basal, the spinosum, and to some extent the granulosum, we're going to have melanin in the keratinocytes of those layers. But as we move more superficially, so really for the most part, by the time you get to the granulosum, the lysosomes, which remember are kind of like the cell's stomach, but the lysosomes in these keratinocytes have started to break down that melanin. And so then by the time we get up here, where we've essentially kicked out everything else from the cell other than the keratin, there's no more melanin in those cells. So they've lost their pigmentation by the time they get up here. And so, obviously you wouldn't need melanin up here because these cells don't have a nucleus, so there's no genetic information to protect. So we only need that melanin in these deeper layers where these keratinocytes still have a nucleus, where they're still making proteins. Let's see. Make sure I got all my important points, and I did. Cool. So let's talk about sweat glands. So 3 kinds of glands that we're going to talk about. The first one, the eccrine sweat glands. So those are your primary sweat glands. We've got lots of those, several million of those. And so their job is to maintain your core temperature, as you can see. So those are merocrine glands. So again, tying it back into what we talked about with chapter 4, remember that merocrine glands merely secrete. So they form vesicles of, in this case, a combination of mostly water, but also some other things like sodium, urea, and ammonia, which are byproducts of protein production. So normally we get rid of those via urine, But one of the other ways that we can get rid of the byproducts of protein production is through sweat. So our little eccrine sweat glands then are going to, in those cells that line the glands, they're going to create vesicles that contain mostly water, but also some sodium, and then again, those waste products like ammonia, and also some proteins that help kill microbes, so some antibacterial proteins that they generate as well. And then, because, tying this back to what I started talking about, because they're Melanin glands, they merely secrete that. So those little vesicles migrate to the outer surface or to the outer cell membrane, and then dump their product onto the skin surface in this case. So again, sweat is mostly water, by mostly water, 99% water. And then just a little bit of those other things that I talked about. So the antibacterial proteins, the, sorry, somebody just walked by while I was recording, so threw me off for a second. So you got the antibacterial proteins, sorry about that. The antibacterial proteins, the ammonia, the urea, and the sodium. And so where the fluid comes from, for the most part, the sweat that we give up, the water that you will lose, is a filtrate of blood. So remember that blood has two primary components. It has plasma, which is the fluid that the red blood cells float in, and then red blood cells. Now there's other stuff, as we'll talk about in the next chapter, but the two primary components of blood are your red blood cells that carry oxygen, and then blood plasma, which is the fluid that they float in. And so you give up that plasma, it then it filters through these deeper layers of the skin, and it moves itself into, so from these deeper vessels, that fluid is given up and then moves into these sweat glands, which then have these tubes that project it out to the sweat pores, out to the skin surface. We give up that fluid. When that water evaporates, that takes some of the heat with it, and so by doing that, it helps us to maintain our core temperature. So as you know, sweating then helps us maintain our core temperature. So we have these sweat glands, lots of them, on the palms of our hands, which you probably know if you've ever been in, if you've ever been in the lab in 186 on those black tables. For whatever reason, those are really sensitive to water. So you'll see if somebody puts their hands flat on those tables, you'll kind of see a little outline of moisture from their hand. And to be gross and honest, sometimes when people sit on the tables, you'll also see a little sweat outline. So you got lots of those on the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, and then also on the forehead. So those are the ones that give up. So the thing to know about eccrine sweat glands, those are sweat glands that primarily give up water, help keep us cool. So that water we give up, we hope it evaporates, takes some heat with it. Then our apocrine sweat glands, now things get gross. So the apocrine sweat glands are also, despite the name, they're also Melanin glands. They also merely secrete through the same fashion that I just mentioned with the eccrine glands. We don't have near as many of those, so whereas we've got millions of the eccrine glands, we only have a couple thousand of these, and they are more localized. So whereas the eccrine glands are pretty much everywhere, other than like your external genitalia, the apocrine glands are pretty well localized to the axillary area, which is your armpits, and then also the anogenital area, which is your groin and moving posteriorly. So near your rectum, and then we'll stick with that. so yeah, in your groin area and your rectum area, that's where your apocrine sweat glands are. And so those also give off fluid, so they also give off quite a bit of water, and they also give off some urea, some ammonia, some of those antibacterial proteins as well. But in addition to that, the apocrine sweat glands, their secretion is a little bit different. It's higher in fatty substances, and then also it's higher in protein content. And so because of that, the product of these apocrine sweat glands, again, in your axillary area, which is your armpits, and then in your groin and moving posteriorly, so the anogenital area, in those areas, what they produce is, rather than being almost exclusively water, because it's got more fat and more proteins in it, it's a lot more viscous, it's a lot thicker. So if we say something is viscous, we think of like motor oil. It's pretty thick, as opposed to water is not viscous, it's fairly thin. So what the apocrine sweat glands produce is fairly viscous. It's also, the book describes it as milky, which is extra gross, and that it has kind of a yellowish color to it. And so on its own, that product doesn't have any odor to it, but once it makes it out onto the skin surface, our skin surface has lots and lots of different bacteria on it, and so when the bacteria interact with that product and degrade that product, that's what produces the unpleasant odor that we associate with body odor. And so no surprise then that is primarily produced in the axillary area, in the armpits. So those glands are actually inactive early in life. They start to produce that product especially during puberty. And so they are stimulated by testosterone primarily. And so we associate testosterone with being the male hormone, but women also produce some testosterone, not in as high of levels as men, but women also produce testosterone. And so that increase in hormones around puberty is what stimulates these glands to become more active and to produce their product. And so that's why, you know, your 13-year-olds start to stink versus your 9-year-old probably didn't, right? What exactly these do is not known. They probably act as some sort of pheromone or chemical messenger, similar to the scent glands in other animals. So still gross. All right, moving on to the sebaceous glands. Those are your oil glands. So we talked about these a little bit, or I talked about these a little bit during the gland discussion in chapter 4. So these, as opposed to where the eccrine glands and the apocrine glands are both merocrine, they merely secrete. Remember, the sebaceous glands are holocrine glands, which means that the whole cell explodes. So it produces a bunch of vesicles of oil, and then the whole cell membrane ruptures once it's all full of those oil vesicles. So those are where they feed into, empty into the hair follicles, as do these apocrine glands, by the way, didn't mention that. So the sebaceous glands empty their oil out into these hair follicles, which then it migrates to the skin surface and then coats the skin surface in that oil. And of course that oil does have a protective function, so it keeps the skin nice and moist, prevents it from becoming too brittle, and then it also slows your water losses. So that oil then, again, you know, helps protect the skin. If skin gets too dry, you slough off more keratin, skin becomes brittle, it's easier to get scrapes and cuts and those kinds of things when you get rid of that oil excessively. Which, so to contextualize that, over the last 12 months, we've all probably washed our hands a lot more than we were used to, and we probably have, you know, used more hand sanitizer. So for the most part, that is like rubbing alcohol based, which then breaks down that oil. So both of those things, the soap and water and then the alcohol-based hand sanitizer, both of those things kill bacteria, but they also break down that oil on the skin surface. So you may have noticed that your hands have been extra dry for the last year. And you know, if that persists for too long, that can lead to some cracking of the skin and then potentially some bleeding. All right, so I think I covered everything I wanted to about the oil glands. Let me double check my notes. Nope, all right, got everything there. All right, so functions of the skin. So again, the primary function of the skin is to protect us from our external environment, and it does that through 3 sets of barriers, or 3 types of barriers. The first type is a chemical barrier, and so the skin surface itself is slightly acidic. And so why does that matter? I mentioned a minute ago that the skin surface is just teeming with bacteria, and so that slightly acidic surface on the skin helps keep those bacteria from replicating quite as fast, so it slows down bacterial reproduction. In addition to that, as mentioned, the eccrine glands in particular produce antibacterial proteins. So those then help to keep the numbers of bacteria down. So the acidity limits their reproduction. Some of the proteins that we secrete through our sweat helps to actually kill the bacteria. And so both of those things, those chemical barriers, help protect us from developing, you know, bacterial skin infections. So things like staph infections in the skin. In addition to that, melatonin, as we talked about, is a chemical barrier, helps protect the DNA and the keratinocytes. Skin also, as we know, provides a physical barrier. So, you know, again, keeps fluid from getting out or in, keeps viruses and bacteria from getting in, at least through the skin, because it is continuous. So remember, the keratinocytes have those junctions between them. So they have tight junctions where they're kind of stitched together, and then they also have desmosomes. And then the glycolipids, remember, form that waterproof barrier, keeping water from moving out or in. And then the hardness of the keratin in the keratinocytes also forms a physical barrier, helps protect us, you know, if we get, you know, impacts or scrapes, etc. And then the last thing there, biological barriers. So you've got your dendritic cells that we talked about. Remember, those are in the deeper layers of the epidermis, and they're going to attack invading microbes, but also in the dermis, so in the more superficial of the two dermal layers, as I mentioned, you also have neutrophils and macrophages that are cruising around in that areolar tissue, ready to attack any invaders. Other things that the skin does, so it helps keep us, regulate our core temperature, and we'll actually talk a lot more about cooling ourselves, evaporative cooling, when we get to the cardiovascular section, because keeping the body cool is one of the many functions of the cardiovascular system. Again, it's going to give up fluid, so that hopefully that fluid will evaporate and help keep us cool. And so here's my sweaty guy. So he's keeping himself cool here during his kettlebell swings. Probably one-arm snatches, I'm guessing he's doing there. In addition to that, skin also tells us about our external environment. So cutaneous sensation deals with skin sensation. So you got a bunch of different types of receptors in the skin. So you've got your tactile or Meissner's corpuscles. And so Meissner's corpuscles are responsible for sensing light touch in hairless skin. So a few minutes ago on the diagram, I was pointing out the follicle receptors. So in skin that has hair on it, so which is most of your skin, right? So that's your forearms, that is your legs, potentially a lot of your trunk, depends on how hairy you are. And so in skin where there is hair, all those hairs have follicle receptors. And so anytime those hairs are deflected, we're aware that something is touching us fairly lightly, probably. And so now we're aware that something's making contact with our skin in that area. But other areas of the skin, like the soles of the feet, palms of the hand, anterior aspect of your forearm for most people, that area is going to be hairless skin. And so since we don't have the follicle receptors there because we don't have hair, then we use tactile or Meissner's corpuscles to alert us to light touch in the areas of hairless skin. Pacinian corpuscles or lamellar corpuscles are responsible for deep pressure. So something is really like, pinching our skin, or even just when you're seated, you're applying pretty significant pressure to the skin overlying your glutes when you're seated. And so we get information about that because that's a type of deep pressure from the Pacinian corpuscles. And then that information is relayed back to the brain, which interprets it as something is compressing the skin in this particular area. And then the last thing on there is our free nerve endings. As mentioned, those do pain sensation. So if something, if it moves from deep pressure to actually a painful or noxious stimuli, then that's going to also activate the free nerve endings. And they're also sensitive to different chemicals. So if you get, acid on your skin, or if you, it's not a chemical, but if you burn yourself, with a flame or something like that, touch a hot stove, the free nerve endings are going to become active to let the brain know that there's some tissue damage going on. So free nerve endings are responsible for pain sensation. Other things the skin does, metabolic functions. So inside of the keratinocytes, you've got cholesterol molecules. They're slightly modified, but you got some cholesterol molecules in there. And in response to sunlight hitting the skin, those cholesterol molecules are converted to a vitamin D precursor, which then leaves the keratinocytes, and then in other tissues is converted to vitamin D. So one of the things that we associate the skin with is production of vitamin D in response to sunlight exposure, and so it does do that. So vitamin D does a number of different things. One of the more important ones is that if you have sufficient vitamin D production, you are able to better absorb calcium in the small intestine. In addition to that, vitamin D also plays an important role in modulating systemic inflammation, which then plays a role in cardiovascular disease and a bunch of other diseases. And then vitamin D also has a role in glucose metabolism. So having a sufficient amount of vitamin D is important for a variety of things, from glucose metabolism to immune function to general inflammation, which is tied into immune function. And so the primary way that we produce that, if we don't consume it, is through sunlight hitting the skin. Now, of course, you can just consume vitamin D. There's supplemental form, but there's also, various food sources. Dairy products are typically fortified with vitamin D, but in addition to that, things like eggs tend to have a fairly high vitamin D content as well. Skin can also serve as a reservoir of the blood. So particularly when we get hot, we'll direct blood flow toward the skin, which is why your skin tends to get kind of flushed if you get hot. So we'll open up some blood vessels in the dermis, and so then that gives skin gives it that flushed appearance. It's from opening up more blood vessels closer to the skin surface. So if all the blood vessels in the skin are dilated, the skin can hold about 5% of our total blood volume. And then the last thing is it helps us get rid of some byproducts of protein production. So as mentioned, some of our sweat also contains, in addition to being mostly water, also contains ammonia and urea, both of which are byproducts of protein production. Helps us maintain water balance. So if you are super well hydrated and you go out and sweat, you're going to actually sweat a little bit more because you got more water to give up. So it helps us maintain water balance and also helps us excrete salt. Now we can do that through the kidneys and then eventually through urination, but one of the ways that we maintain our salt concentrations is through sweating. I didn't mention this earlier, but you have broadly two types of sweat, perceptible sweat and imperceptible sweat. So we do actually sweat a little bit throughout the day and even, like overnight. Most of us produce somewhere in the neighborhood of a pint, so about 16 ounces of sweat across the day. That is categorized as that imperceptible sweat. So it's not like, oh man, I'm sweating. You don't know it's happening. And so, the example I gave that I didn't specifically refer to, but where you would see that is, if you go into 186 and you touch the lab table, those black lab tables, and you see kind of a heat outline of your hand, that would be some of that imperceptible sweating that you would see there. This was a fun fact in the book, and I stole it, but that's okay. So the imperceptible sweating, again, accounts for about a pint of fluid per day, so about 16 ounces. If you're a really heavy sweater and you are continuously well hydrated, so if you're exercising in the heat and you are continuing to consume fluids, some people can produce as much as 3 gallons a day of sweat. So if you think about that, a gallon of water weighs about 8 pounds, and so that person could then produce about 24 pounds of water loss, fluid loss, over the course of that day, which is amazing. But of course, that would be perceptible sweat. If you're losing that much water, you know it. All right, and then 2 more things. One is skin cancer, and that's what this week's discussion board is about, skin cancer. So skin cancer is the most common kind of cancer, affects 1 in 5 people across the lifespan, and the primary cause of it is UV radiation, because UV radiation damages the DNA and those keratinocytes, and specifically what it does, or what it appears to do, is to disable a gene that limits cell reproduction. Because effectively what cancer is just unchecked, unlimited cell reproduction. And so when we develop skin cancer, the particular damage to the DNA has been to one of the genes that helps limit cell production. So in terms of the different kinds of cancers, so you've got the first one here, basal cell carcinoma, and that's what's pictured there on the right. This lady has a little basal cell carcinoma there. So fairly common cancer. It actually is the most common form, but it is the least malignant. So if we say that a cancer is malignant, what we mean is that it has, that it's cancerous, that it's bad, as opposed to being benign. I was almost mixing up my M terms there. So malignant cancer is, or malignant growth is one that is cancerous, as opposed to one that's benign is non-cancerous. But the term I was going for there, or I was thinking of as I was talking, was metastatic. So anything that metastasizes leaves its original site. So if a cancer metastasizes, if it was a skin cancer, a metastatic skin cancer is one that has left the original site of the skin and migrated to other tissues. So maybe now it has migrated to the lungs and started to develop a tumor there. That's a metastatic cancer. So the good thing about basal cell carcinoma is that even though it's the most common, it doesn't often metastasize, because that's when cancer becomes problematic and potentially fatal, is when the cancer moves to other parts of the body, when it spreads. And so this particular type, basal cell carcinoma, doesn't tend to metastasize, and it's typically cured by surgical removal. So they can go through and actually just remove this lesion, and then typically people who have it are fine. So what happens there, so this is actually the deepest layer of the epidermis, so this is the stratum basal, and so you're going to get damage to the keratinocytes in that deepest layer, and so they just reproduce even more than they already are, so faster mitosis, but they disregard the border between the epidermis and the dermis, and they actually invade the underlying dermis, and so then that's what leads to this lesion that you see, is this you get extra layers of keratinocytes in that area. So basal cell is or affects the deepest layer, the stratum basal. Squamous cell, we're going to move up a little bit into the stratum spinosum, and so also affects the keratinocytes. So these top two affect the keratinocytes. One of the unfortunate things about squamous cell, and this is a picture of it, is that it does tend to grow rapidly and it does tend to metastasize, but often because they become these fairly obvious, like scaly kind of lesions, people generally notice them because you've got this, oftentimes people describe them as kind of like this non-healing wound, like they've just got this scab, they don't know how it got there, and it just keeps flaking and keeps bleeding. That would be a squamous cell carcinoma. That's kind of the classic description of one of those. And so if they don't let it go too long and they go see a dermatologist about it or go see a GP and then a dermatologist about it, they'll remove it. And typically these are ones that, with removal, have complete recovery. But these are ones that will metastasize if you let them go too long. So potentially they're fatal, but as long as you catch them early, these are usually okay. And then the real bad one is melanoma. So melanoma, as you'd expect, is a cancer of the melanocytes. One of the problems with those is because of their connections to all the other cells, they tend to multiply and they tend to migrate into the underlying connective tissue. Sorry, talking too fast. Tend to migrate into the underlying connective tissue, and they also move into the underlying blood and lymph vessels pretty quickly and easily. So melanoma tends to metastasize fairly readily, and then once it does metastasize, it tends to be resistant to chemotherapy. And so even though melanoma is pretty uncommon, and it only accounts for about 1% of skin cancers, it accounts for the majority of deaths, because once it develops, if you don't see it early, it moves to the rest of the body really quickly, and then once it's moved into other tissues, it's not very responsive to the treatments that we have, primarily chemotherapy. So it can start anywhere that there's pigment, because again, it's going to arise from the melanocytes. About a third of them arise from pre-existing moles, and so that's where the A, B, C, D, E's come in. So you can see the benign one, the non-cancerous one over here, is the same on both sides, as opposed to the melanoma isn't the same shape. When you divide it in two, it's asymmetrical. They have uneven borders. There are several different colors in the mole. Has a fairly large diameter, so you can see over 1/4 inch, and it's constantly changing. That's an evolving mole. So any of those things, if it's asymmetrical, has an uneven border, multiple colors in it, a fairly large diameter, over 1/4 inch, and if it's a mole that's evolving, those are things that you would want to get checked out. So those are the ABCDs refer to melanoma, which again, a fairly uncommon skin cancer, but the most deadly of them. And then the other thing is that while melanoma a third of the time appears from pre-existing moles, it can also arise spontaneously. So it can generate a new mole, which is then would have these characteristics, and then could move elsewhere in the body. All right, and then last thing is aging skin. How does the skin change with age? As you'd imagine, the rate of keratinocyte mitosis slows down, and so the result then is that the skin becomes thin and more easily damaged. You've probably noticed that in some of your elderly relatives, or if you've worked, like in a nursing home or assisted living facility, any work you might have done with the elderly, you might have noticed that they bruise really, really easily, and they get cut really, really easily. And so the reason for that is that because the skin becomes much, much thinner as we age, and that owes in part to the reduction in the rate of reproduction of the keratinocytes in that stratum basal. In addition to that, so in addition to not producing as many keratinocytes, the sebaceous glands, the oil glands, become less active. And so again, that oil is protective for the skin and keeps it from being quite as brittle. And so if your oil production decreases, then the skin becomes easier to tear. So if the skin's thinner and then has less oil, it's more susceptible to damage, particularly cuts and scrapes. The elastic fibers in the underlying dermis tend to become clumped together and stiffer as well, as do the collagen fibers. And so the result of that is that's when you start to get that wrinkling, is that the elastic fibers aren't quite as stretchy. They don't bounce back like they used to. And so those are those wrinkles that accumulate with age as the elastic fibers change the way that they align. You're going to get a decrease in your subcutaneous fat, which also then plays a role in the skin thinning and becoming more easily damaged. I hinted at this earlier. So remember, your dendritic cells are in those deeper layers of the epidermis, and the dendritic cells, in addition to attacking invading pathogens, will also attack cancer cells. You get less of those protective, less of those immune dendritic cells as we age, and so that's one of the reasons that we become more likely to develop skin cancer with age, is because you have less of that first line of defense. You have less of those dendritic cells to attack abnormal keratinocytes. That, combined with the fact that you have kind of the accumulation of a lifetime of UV exposure, so those two things combine to increase our risk of skin cancer as we get older. Your hair follicle activity decreases, so you're going to see hair thinning and hair loss with age, as you probably know. And that was definitely the last thing. I thought I might have one more thing in my notes, but that's it. All right, so let's see. How do we do on time? Oh, still an hour. Sorry. But that's it. So there's no parts 2 and 3 for this. So that's the entirety of the skin lecture, and the next week we're going to move on to blood.